When the Second World War ended, America exhaled with relief. Then, immediately began holding its breath again. The victorious glow of 1945 faded into the anxious dawn of the Cold War. In Hollywood, that tension found its own peculiar expression. The film industry had been a vital propaganda tool during the war, producing morale-boosting features, patriotic newsreels, and carefully scripted versions of the American way of life. The public had flocked to theaters, and the studios had made money hand over fist. But by the late 1940s, with peace restored and soldiers returning home, a new kind of uncertainty set in. Part of the unease was economic. Wartime contracts and government subsidies vanished, and a flood of returning veterans meant more workers competing for jobs in every field, including entertainment. But there was also a deeper undercurrent. Labor was on the march. Across the United States, unions had grown in size and influence during the war years, taking advantage of full employment and wartime bargaining leverage to win concessions from management. Hollywood's workers were no exception. The Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, alongside the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild, had become increasingly assertive. They weren't just talking about wages anymore. They were pressing for residual payments for films shown on television, better health and pension benefits, and protections against the grueling, sometimes dangerous working conditions of studio shoots. For studio executives, these demands carried an ominous echo. To them, organized labor wasn't merely a negotiating partner. It was a potential existential threat. They saw strikes in other industries paralyzing production lines and worried that the same thing could happen in the film business. And as the ideological climate of the Cold War hardened, they began to view militant unionism and left-wing politics as two sides of the same coin. It was into this fraught landscape that a new kind of labor leader emerged, one whose style was as important as his politics. He was not a firebrand on a soapbox or a hard-nosed negotiator banging the table. Instead, he exuded reassurance. He had the steady, familiar cadence of a man used to public speaking, the practiced ease of someone comfortable under bright lights. He shook hands with a smile, laughed at the right moments, and told stories that made his listeners feel they were in on the joke. His warmth, however, was more than just personal charm. It was a calculated political asset. He presented himself as a bridge between two worlds, labor and management, actors and moguls, the everyday working performer and the gilded elite who signed the checks. His rhetoric was laced with appeals to unity and patriotism. He spoke of the shared responsibility to protect the industry from disruption and divisive forces. He did not openly rail against unions themselves. After all, he led one. But he drew a sharp distinction between what he called reasonable unionism and radical unionism. The radicals, in his telling, were not just troublemakers, but potential enemies of the American way of life. He suggested that their agitation was less about improving conditions for workers than about undermining the stability of the nation. He warned that some within the labor movement were influenced or outright controlled by communist ideology, and that their real aim was to use strikes and unrest as tools to sow chaos. This framing allowed him to position himself as a defender of the union's integrity, while simultaneously aligning with the studio's desire to avoid costly work stoppages and their fear of leftist infiltration. It was a masterful balancing act. He assured the rank and file that he was protecting their interests, keeping the union from being tainted by political extremism that might turn public opinion against them. At the same time, he reassured the executives that he would keep SAG, and by extension, Hollywood labor, firmly in the camp of moderation, cooperation, and predictability. His genial manner made it all seem natural, even inevitable. In the climate of the late 1940s, when suspicion and loyalty tests were becoming currency in public life, his brand of friendly anti-communism proved to be exactly what both Hollywood power brokers and Washington's Cold Warriors were looking for. But behind that warm smile, however, was the steel edge of a man who understood that the quickest path to influence in post-war Hollywood was not through confrontation, but through the careful shaping of alliances, and the quiet sidelining of anyone who challenged the terms of those alliances. By the late 1940s, America was a nation living in the long shadow of victory. The Second World War had ended in triumph, but almost as soon as the confetti had settled, the mood shifted. The Soviet Union, our wartime ally, was now recast as a looming adversary. The rhetoric of freedom versus tyranny was everywhere, and in Washington, the machinery of suspicion was being built at a breakneck pace. Loyalty oaths, congressional hearings, and investigations into un-American activities had become fixtures in the political landscape. Hollywood, as both a cultural factory and a highly visible industry, found itself squarely in the crosshairs. The film business was more than just entertainment. It was, in the eyes of the government, a powerful instrument for shaping public opinion. If communists could influence the screen, the thinking went, they could influence the nation. This fear was amplified by the presence of outspoken leftists in the creative community, screenwriters, actors, and directors, many of whom had been active in progressive causes during the Depression and the war years. While most were driven by ideals of social justice, equality, and workers' rights, in the climate of the early Cold War, those positions were easily recast as fellow traveling with the enemy. The studios were alarmed, not just because of the government scrutiny, but because public suspicion could damage the bottom line. A studio's brand was built on its stars and its image. If a major name became tainted by accusations of communist sympathy, it wasn't just a political problem. It was a business catastrophe. Investors, advertisers, and theater owners might balk. Audiences might turn away. In this environment, the specter of communism was as much a threat to profitability as it was, supposedly, to democracy. It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and profit protection that a particular kind of union leader could thrive. One who could speak fluently in the language of anti-communism, but without the blunt authoritarianism that might alienate its own members. Ronald Reagan didn't pound the table, and didn't declare himself an industry watchdog in the service of management. Instead, he wrapped his message in the language of safeguarding careers, protecting reputations, and keeping the industry clean for the good of all. To the actors he represented, he offered a promise that he would stand as a buffer between them and the taint of radical politics. He warned them that association with militant labor activists could destroy a career overnight, not because of skill or talent, but because of a blacklist that, while unofficial, was very real. He cast himself as the man who could keep their names off that list, not by fighting blacklisting itself, but by ensuring that they never gave anyone an excuse to put them on it. To the studio executives, the pitch was different but complementary. He assured them that under his watch, the union would remain stable, cooperative, and free of agitation. Strikes would be avoided. Demands would be tempered. Negotiations would be framed in terms of mutual interest rather than class struggle. He positioned himself as a firewall against the kind of militant activism that had disrupted other industries, and as a quiet enforcer of ideological conformity within his own ranks. In this reframing, the enemy of Hollywood labor was not the studio system with its exploitive contracts and lopsided profit sharing, nor the widening gulf between executive pay and the average performer's wage. The new enemy was something more nebulous and, therefore, more useful to those in power: the supposed infiltration of unions by communist organizers. The danger wasn't that you weren't being paid enough. It was that your co-worker in the next dressing room might be secretly plotting the downfall of America. By shifting the frame, economic grievances could be delegitimized almost overnight. If you went on strike, you weren't fighting for fair residuals or humane working hours. You were playing into the hands of Moscow. If you spoke out about unfair contracts, you risked being labeled as politically suspect. This was the brilliance and the cruelty of the convenient enemy. It allowed those in power to turn any challenge into an act of disloyalty, and to present compliance as not only smart business, but patriotic duty. And for a union leader who understood the political winds of the moment, it was the perfect niche to occupy. Protector of the industry's image, guarantor of labor peace, and the smiling face of a purge that didn't always look like a purge. The anti-radical stance that came to define his leadership was not merely about expelling communists or silencing the most militant voices. It was about fundamentally redrawing the boundaries of what a union was for, and, more importantly, what it was not. In his rhetoric, a union was not a weapon in the larger struggle between labor and capital. It was a professional association, a facilitator, a mediator. Its role was to negotiate politely and in good faith with employers, to secure modest incremental gains without disturbing the stability of the industry. Confrontation in this vision was not only undesirable, it was borderline irresponsible. Strikes, he argued, should be the very last resort, something to be avoided at almost any cost. In practice, this often meant avoiding them altogether, even in situations where members felt that direct action was the only way to be heard. To Hollywood's moguls, this was a revelation. Here was a labor leader who didn't see management as an adversary to be pressured, but as a partner to be courted. The old, uneasy truce between labor and the studios, built on mutual suspicion and the occasional strike threat, could now be replaced with something far more comfortable, a managed, predictable relationship. Negotiations became less about drawing hard lines in the sand, and more about finding compromises that kept production humming and avoided bad publicity. In public, this arrangement was framed as pragmatic realism. The studios and the guilds, it was said, shared a common interest: the success of the film industry. If the studios prospered, the logic went, so would the actors, directors, and writers. In this worldview, the financial fortunes of labor and management were intertwined, and conflict only hurt both sides. This was a seductive idea, especially in an industry built on glamour and the illusion of a family-like community. But the costs of this business-friendly unionism were less visible and more insidious. By deliberately avoiding confrontation, the union limited its own leverage. Incremental gains became the ceiling, not the starting point. The most aggressive demands for change, whether higher residuals, profit sharing, or broader workplace protections, were dismissed as unrealistic or counterproductive. A union's willingness to temper its own demands in the name of stability made it easier for management to resist deeper reforms. The other, perhaps more damaging consequence, was the deliberate rejection of solidarity with other unions, especially those tarred with the radical brush. When other Hollywood unions, like the Conference of Studio Unions, the CSU, clashed with the moguls, Reagan's SAG kept its distance. Even when the issues overlapped, fair contracts, better working conditions, he insisted that his members had nothing to gain from getting involved in someone else's fight. To him, solidarity with militants risked guilt by association, and guilt by association could be career suicide. This isolationism worked exactly as the studios hoped. Without united action, the broader Hollywood movement fractured. Divided, the unions were easier to manage. Some even played against each other when their contracts were up for renewal. Management could grant small concessions to the reasonable unions while crushing strikes led by the radical ones, setting an example for anyone tempted to challenge the arrangement. Over time, this redefinition of unionism, one that prioritized cooperation with employers, embraced incrementalism, and shunned solidarity, helped entrench a two-tiered labor environment in Hollywood. On one tier were the moderate unions, rewarded with stability and modest gains. On the other were the militant holdouts, increasingly marginalized and vilified. For the moguls, it was the best of both worlds. They could claim to respect unions while keeping them firmly under control. For the man at the center of it, the rewards were personal as well as political. His image as a steady, responsible leader made him a trusted figure in both Hollywood and Washington. He had navigated the treacherous waters of Cold War politics, not by resisting them, but by shaping his union to fit perfectly within their currents. What he left behind was a model of labor leadership that would echo far beyond the sound stages of Los Angeles, and a model in which a union's greatest success was not in challenging power, but in managing it. With the benefit of hindsight, Reagan's career read less like an isolated Hollywood story and more like the opening act of a nationwide drama. The choices he made, the alliances he cultivated, and the compromises he embraced all foreshadowed a labor management relationship that would become increasingly common in mid-20th century America. It was the story of a slow pivot, from unions as engines of collective action to unions as managers of discontent. In the decades that followed, similar scenes would play out far from the backlots of Hollywood. In steel mills, automobile factories, and shipping docks, moderate labor leaders would adopt the same posture, break with militant factions, distance themselves from the language of class struggle, and focus on securing small, steady gains rather than risking confrontation for larger victories. The justification was always the same: stability, pragmatism, and the avoidance of unnecessary conflict. But what was lost in the process was harder to see in the moment. By abandoning solidarity with more militant unions, moderates undermined the very source of labor's historic strength, its ability to act as a united front across industries. Strikes became localized events instead of nationwide movements. Demand shrank to fit within management's comfort zone. The labor movement, once feared by industrial titans for its ability to mobilize millions, became fragmented and easier to contain. In many cases, the leaders who pursued this course found themselves rewarded, not by the members necessarily, but by the power structures that they learned to navigate. They gained personal prestige, access to political circles, and a seat at the table where deals were made. They were praised as responsible voices who understood the needs of both workers and employers. In the short term, they delivered contracts that looked respectable on paper and avoided the bruising spectacle of drawn-out strikes. The cost, however, was long-term. Wages stagnated relative to corporate profits. Benefits, once won, became vulnerable to rollback. The next generation of workers entered a labor landscape where the scope of ambition had already been narrowed. And while management retained its full arsenal of tactics, labor's was diminished, not by outright defeat, but by a gradual redefinition of the fight itself. Hollywood's Cold War labor politics offered an especially vivid microcosm of this transformation. In an industry built on image, the optics of cooperation mattered as much as the reality. The smiling, non-confrontational leader who spoke the language of patriotism and reason was a perfect fit for both the studios and the Times. He reassured executives that their authority was safe, soothed actors with the promise of career protection, and, intentionally or not, modeled a form of unionism that was more about managing expectations than challenging inequities. For the studio, this was an ideal outcome. A union leader who could deliver labor peace without the need for heavy-handed suppression. For Washington's Cold Warriors, it was proof that labor could be disciplined into ideological conformity without openly dismantling it. But for the broader labor movement, Hollywood's example was a warning sign. One that, in the rush to embrace stability, too many ignored. The result was a pattern that would replicate it for decades. Unions that survived not by building power, but by accommodating it. Leaders who were lauded as statesmen while presiding over the slow erosion of worker leverage. And a labor movement that, by the close of the 20th century, would find itself far weaker, less united, and less capable of mounting the kind of coordinated action that had once reshaped American life. In the end, Reagan's legacy was defined as much by his charm as by his politics, perhaps more so. For all the speeches he gave and all the policies he shaped, what lingered in the public memory was the image, the easy grin, the steady gaze, the air of confidence that suggested everything was under control. He seemed to embody the Hollywood ideal, a man as comfortable in front of the camera as he was behind the closed doors of a labor negotiation. This was no accident. In an industry built on illusion, Reagan understood the power of performance. His genial manner was itself a form of political currency, one that allowed him to advance an agenda without appearing combative or coercive. By projecting warmth, he made difficult compromises seem like sensible resolutions. By framing concessions as responsible, he transformed limitations into virtues. And by presenting himself as the reasonable middle ground between labor unrest and managerial dominance, he positioned his personal style as a kind of political philosophy. The studios loved it. Here was a union leader who didn't just keep the peace. He did it with a smile that reassured shareholders and moviegoers alike that all was well in the dream factory. The public image of Hollywood remained one of glamour, creativity, and unity, even as the realities behind the scenes told a different story. Workers who pushed for more than incremental change were painted as disruptive, or worse, suspicious. Solidarity across guilds frayed. The broader labor movement in Hollywood, once a potential force for significant industry-wide reform, was quietly tamed. Yet, his geniality served another purpose in the Cold War climate. It softened the hard edges of ideology. In Washington, the anti-communist cause was often pursued through blunt instruments, investigations, subpoenas, public shaming. In Hollywood, Reagan managed to dress the same cause in tailored suits and a warm handshake. Here, patriotism wasn't barked from a podium. It was smiled into existence, woven seamlessly into the culture of an industry that exported American values to the world. Behind the bright lights and the marquee names, Hollywood had become another front in the ideological battle of the Cold War. In that battle, his role was carefully scripted and expertly performed. He was a friendly gatekeeper who had promised to protect the industry from dangerous influences, while making sure the machinery of production never stopped turning. For the moguls, he was an ideal ally. For Washington, he was proof that loyalty could be cultivated without brute force. For the labor movement, he was a paradox. An elected leader who, in the name of protecting his members, had helped blunt their collective power. And perhaps that was the real brilliance of his performance. By the time the curtain fell, the audience wasn't entirely sure whether they had been watching a political drama or a feel-good picture. All they knew was that the star looked great doing it, and the credits rolled over a Hollywood that seemed, at least on the surface, exactly as it should be.